Well, my parents were utterly supportive of anything I ever wanted to do and encouraged me to dream dreams of things I hadn't thought about, both my father and my mother. And my mother was the first director of the Commission for Women in the ELCA, although I was already a pastor by then. And I would also say that a person in college, William Sloane Coffin, was the college chaplain at Yale when I was there. And at the time I was there, he was very active in anti-war and other sorts of liberal causes. And for me, he pulled together, as a church person, pulled together scholarly integrity and also a passion for social justice, and was really a fine model for being able to do those two things and be in the church. When I was in 7th grade, in confirmation class, the enthusiastic associate pastor was going through a curriculum, and on that day he was assigned to talk to people about church careers. And so he would talk about different things people do in the church and how many people would be interested in that. And he went through a whole list of them. When we got to pastor, I thought, well, that sounds like the best, and I raised my hand, and it really sort of threw him, because that was before 1970 and women were not yet allowed to be pastors in the church. And he sort of hemmed and hawed, and it was uncomfortable for him because he'd not been faced with that. And so as he told me I couldn't, that was kind of a reason to say, yeah, okay, so I'll do that. And I did have a wonderful follow-up with him some years later when I was ordained, and I'd been a campus pastor for a few years. He then became newly a campus pastor. And so I was the celebrant at an opening Eucharist at the campus pastor's meeting, and he was a newbie, and that was just kind of fun. And I reminded him of the 7th grade experience, which he denied fully, but it meant a lot to me, and I remembered it. My husband was a lawyer, and there was a woman in the law firm where he worked who was a senior partner. She then became a judge. She was the first woman to graduate from Harvard Law School, and she was in the top of her class. And she couldn't get a job for several years because she was a woman. This would have been in the 50s. And she eventually, they offered her jobs as paralegals, but eventually she got a job in this firm, this old blue blood firm. And she was sort of one of my influences. She was a Jewish grandmother, and we ran into each other at Filene's basement and had a really significant conversation. We were trying to decide, my husband and I were trying to decide, after graduating from law school, whether to go to Washington, D.C. or California or stay in Boston. And her advice to me was, go to a place where they've already had a woman serving, so you can learn how to be a pastor and not spend all your time being the freak or justifying your gender. And that was really, really good advice for me. So, a Jewish judge is one of my mentors as well. I wasn't surrounded by a culture of people who thought that becoming a Lutheran pastor was normal, natural, or a good idea. Why would you throw away your life? Working for the church, good grief. So, there's those kinds of barriers of what a waste of talent to go work for the church. So the world not taking the church seriously was one of my barriers. Then I was the first woman to be elected chair of the Conference of Bishops in the ELCA, and there was some to do about that. There was an article in the Lutheran that said, woman elected chair of the conference, and I gave the editor of the Lutheran a hard time about that, and he said, well, it is news that you are a woman, because I was saying, if a man had been elected, would you have written man elected? And he said, no, but you're the first woman. So I'm aware of all the firsts, and I'm also aware of the people who went before me, who broke down doors and had sustained broken shoulders and head injuries, etc., for having broken down those doors. And I've broken down a number of doors myself, but I haven't done it all on my own. I'm standing on the shoulders of 4 mothers and 4 sisters. So there's still tremendous sexism and patriarchy built into our system. I'm aware of all that, and I work with it. I'm working with a couple of seminarians, not from here, but from other places, who have experienced real gender harassment and extremely painful situations, and we're not past that by a long shot. But I'm also in a position where I can speak on that, and I take that very seriously, the responsibility to point that stuff out, to speak on it, to call people on it, and I try to do it with a pleasant smile on my face. But, in fact, that's part of my calling, is to identify where there's injustice, and I have a particularly keen understanding of injustice when it comes to gender. I would like my legacy, I guess, to be one of openness and fairness and justice, and especially for the church to be involved in justice issues in the world, for women to be treated equally as men in the church and in the world, and for laity to be taken very seriously in the church. There's a story that Elizabeth Moltmann Wendell tells about Martha. It's in a European myth about Martha, and it's about dragons. St. George is the one who slays the dragon. The story of St. Martha is that she subdues the dragon. She takes off her girdle, her sash, her belt, and she subdues the dragon rather than killing it. And I think that's sort of can be a model for women's ministry as well. We don't have to prove how macho we are by killing dragons, and sometimes it's actually more effective simply to subdue them. So even though that's not at all biblical, I think it's a wonderful kind of story, wonderful kind of image.